It is day 2 of the 2022 NHL offseason, and before things really pick up, I wanted to make a one from every team video of some sort previewing every team heading into the summer. So in today's video, I'm going to go over my biggest question for every NHL team heading into the offseason, and of course I'm always interested to hear what you guys have to say, so be sure to get down there in the comments and let me know what your biggest question is for your favorite team this offseason. Starting things off with the Anaheim Ducks, my biggest question is definitely, will they move John Gibson? John Gibson made comments about a potential trade a couple of weeks ago. He said he would be open to that idea. The Ducks are going to look a lot different next season. They were one of the biggest sellers at this most recent trade deadline. They moved Lindholm, Manson, Raquel. Ryan Getzlaf has now retired, so he's no longer going to be a part of the team. So I'm definitely really interested to see if John Gibson is going to be one of the guys to kind of see this rebuild through, or if he's going to be starting for a new team next season. The Arizona Coyotes, this is more so a question for them heading into next season as opposed to this offseason. I'm just really intrigued to see what the heck it's going to look like watching an NHL team play their home games in a college arena where they can't even have their own logo at center ice. I think that's going to be fascinating. The Boston Bruins, my biggest question is definitely, do they try to remain competitive next season despite the likes of Charlie McAvoy undergoing surgery, Brad Marchand undergoing surgery as well? They're both going to miss an extended period of time to start next season. We don't even know if Patrice Bergeron is coming back, so part of me feels like maybe we could see Boston do like a little one-year tank, kind of like what the Golden State Warriors did in the NBA. The Buffalo Sabres, the biggest question for me definitely is in net. Which goalie are they going to sign or trade for this offseason? Because they really don't have a goaltending tandem right now heading into next season. Aaron Dell is a UFA, Michael Hauser's a UFA, Tokarski's a UFA, Malcolm Subban, Craig Anderson, all goaltenders that made appearances for them this past season. Now they do have Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen, who is currently an RFA. I imagine Buffalo's going to get him signed, but I can't see them heading into next season with him as the starter. I feel like he's going to be the backup. The Calgary Flames, this is an easy one. Can they get Johnny Gaudreau an extension before free agency opens? Because that's when things can get kind of dicey. Once free agency hits and other teams can start making offers, that's when you get into a bidding war. Things get pretty unpredictable from there, so Calgary, you definitely think they want to get their MVP caliber players signed before that happens. My question for the Carolina Hurricanes is actually kind of regarding Tony DeAngelo. Obviously, they signed him to a one-year, $1 million contract heading into this season, and it worked out well for them. DeAngelo was one of the highest scoring defensemen in the league this year. We didn't hear of any off-ice issues or anything like that, so I'm interested to see if Carolina plans on bringing DeAngelo back, or if he's kind of priced himself out of Carolina, because there's no way he's going to be only making $1 million again next season, and the Hurricanes still do have some other pretty high-profile UFAs to worry about, like Niederreiter and Trocheck, and also Natchez is an RFA as well. The Chicago Blackhawks, this one's easily, do they actually end up trading Alex DeBrincat? DeBrincat has been subject to a lot of trade rumors over the past couple of weeks. Frank Seravalli has said that he feels like it's a matter of when, not if, Alex DeBrincat gets traded, and the whole thing still kind of confuses me a little bit, because even if the Hawks do plan on going through a rebuild, I feel like DeBrincat is one of the guys they should probably keep to build around, but that's just me. The Colorado Avalanche, the Stanley Cup champions of 2022, this one's pretty simple for me. How much of that Stanley Cup winning team are they going to be able to bring back? Now, Colorado does have a lot of cap space this offseason, upwards of $25.5 million, but they have so many players that need new deals. Some of the UFAs include Andre Burakovsky, Andrew Cogliano, Darren Helm, Nazem Kadri, Nico Sturm, Valerie Nichushkin, Ryan Murray, Josh Manson, Jack Johnson, Darcy Kemper, and they also have a pretty notable RFA as well in Arturi Lehkonen, who I'm sure they want to bring back after his performance in the Stanley Cup playoffs. So Joe Sakic definitely has a very busy offseason ahead of him. My biggest question for the Blue Jackets is definitely, do they decide to lock up Patrick Laine long term? He's a restricted free agent. He's still yet to get a long-term deal in his career. It's just been bridge contracts after his ELC was up. So I'm definitely intrigued to see if Columbus decides to put their faith in him, give him a big long-term contract, and kind of make him one of the faces of the franchise. The Dallas Stars, my biggest question for them is, will they end up losing John Klingberg for absolutely nothing? He's set to become a UFA, and obviously, as we all know, earlier in the season, he actually requested a trade. Dallas decided to hold on to him. They kept him for the playoff push, and I guess it kind of worked out because they made the playoffs, but then again, they lost in the first round. You know, was that worth potentially losing a player like John Klingberg for nothing, who's been so good for Dallas for such a long time. The Red Wings, the biggest question easily has to be, who's going to be the head coach? A lot of candidates are now off the table. Barry Trotz has decided not to coach this season. Paul Maurice is in Florida, DeBoer is in Dallas, Tortorella is in Philly, Bruce Cassidy's in Vegas. You get the idea. The biggest question for the Oilers easily has to be, can they find a long-term option in net? Mike Smith is still signed through next season, but he's 40 years old. Is that the guy you want as your starter heading into next season? Ideally, I feel like you go out, you get a starter that's likely going to be the starter long-term, and you have Mike Smith serve as the backup in a role that isn't so physically demanding. I feel like at his age, Mike Smith would be a lot better suited as being a backup for this final season under contract with the Oilers than being the starter again. The Florida Panthers, I'm going to go with, are they able to bring back Claude Giroux? They only have a little over $3 million in projected cap space, and their three most notable UFAs are Claude Giroux, Mason Marchment, and Ben Sherratt. You're likely only going to be able to bring back like one of the three unless you shed some cap somewhere. Maybe Patrick Hornqvist, you can get rid of the final year of his deal somehow. My question for the Los Angeles Kings is, how are they going to take the next step? Obviously, they had a great season, made the playoffs, pushed the Edmonton Oilers to 7 games in the first round, and now where do they go from here? Do they try to spend some future assets to make a big splash, or do they hope that the development of the younger players is what, kind of takes them to that next level? The Minnesota Wild, my biggest question is definitely, how are they going to approach the offseason now that the dead cap space from the Suter and Parise buyouts kicks in? Obviously, Kevin Fiala is subject to a lot of trade rumors, likely because Minnesota just isn't going to be able to afford to extend him. My biggest question for the Canadians is definitely regarding the draft. Is Shane Wright a true lock at number 1? And whoever they decide to take, are they going to play in the NHL right away? Funny enough, Bob McKenzie's top prospects list actually came out today, and he had Slavkovsky, I believe that's how you say his name, at number 1, so kind of interesting. Next up, we have the Nashville Predators. This one's kind of vague, but it's what direction do they decide to go in? I feel like they're really close to being stuck as a mediocre team for a very, very long time, and I feel like that's honestly one of the worst places to be in as an NHL team or just a professional sports team in general. They can probably be good enough to push for the playoffs and potentially make it next year depending on what happens with Philip Forsberg, but we saw them do that this year. They made the playoffs, but they just got annihilated in round 1 against Colorado. Moving on now to the Devils, my question for them is, do they decide to use and draft with the second overall pick or actually trade the pick? There's been a lot of talk about them potentially moving it because of the position that they're in. They're trying to win now. We saw them go out and sign Dougie Hamilton last offseason. They already have a plethora of young talent and good prospects that are likely going to be pushing for roster spots next season. It may be in the Devils' best interest to cash in that second overall pick and get an already solidified star caliber player as opposed to hoping for a star caliber player when you draft with it. And even if you do draft a guy that's going to be a star eventually, it's likely going to take him a couple of years anyway. The New York Islanders, after a rough season, do they run it back next year with mostly the same team, or do they make big changes this offseason? I kind of feel like they're going to run it back because sure, they had a really disappointing year, but it was kind of a unique circumstance. Obviously, they didn't play a home game for like, what was it, the first 2 months of the season or something crazy like that, and they did actually heat up a little bit down the stretch, but at that point it was just too late. My biggest question for the Rangers is what happens with Capo Caco. He was a healthy scratch in Game 6 of the Eastern Conference Finals against Tampa Bay. Gerard Gallant was asked about this after the game, and he said he was just trying to win a hockey game. He was pretty blunt about it. This led to a lot of speculation about Caco's future with the team. Is there even going to ever be a spot for him in the top 6? So I'm kind of intrigued to see what they decide to do with him this offseason. My biggest question for the Ottawa Senators is, how do they make a big splash this offseason? They got $23.5 million in cap space. Their really only big name player that they have to sign that's going to command a lot of money is Josh Norris. They could make a splash in free agency, but as we know, they've been kind of stingy with their money, not wanting to spend to the cap, but also at the same time, they said it's time to start winning, so, it's kind of, you got to pick one. You can't keep doing both. The Philadelphia Flyers, how do you go about replacing Claude Giroux, who was their captain, who was their best player for such a long time? We know that they want to remain competitive, or I feel like they wouldn't have brought in John Tortorella as the head coach, but looking at that roster, is that good enough to compete for a playoff spot in the Metro Division? They don't have a ton of cap space heading into the offseason either, just a little over $5 million, so the Flyers are definitely in a weird spot. The big question for the Penguins is pretty simple. Are they going to be able to bring back both Chris Letang and Evgeny Malkin, two of the guys who have been the faces of the franchise along with Sidney Crosby for over a decade now? And if they aren't able to bring those guys back, or if they're only able to bring back one over the other, the question then becomes, how are they going to replace whichever one they lost, or potentially both? I honestly struggled with this one for the San Jose Sharks. My question is literally just like, what do you do in the position like the Sharks are in? Their roster is not good enough to make the playoffs, in my opinion, and we saw that in each of the past 2 seasons. They only have a little over $5.5 million in cap space. They have so much money tied up in 3 aging defensemen in Vlasic, Burns, and Carlson, but none of those contracts are really tradable. I really don't know what you do if you're the Sharks in this position. My question for the Seattle Kraken is, how do they maximize their cap space? They have a little under $23 million in projected cap space for this offseason, and they really don't have any core guys that are in need of a new contract. Sure, there's guys like Donato and Geeky that I'm sure you want to get signed, but that's not going to cost much at all. Their important players are signed, they got a ton of money to spend. How are they going to maximize that? My question for the St. Louis Blues is, can you put your full trust in Jordan Binnington to be, an above average starter? Ville Husso was the better goaltender for the majority of this past season. Obviously things changed in the postseason, but Ville Husso's a UFA now. They're most likely going to have to replace him because I can't see Husso wanting to come back to a team when he most likely feels he can start for other teams in the league. He's probably going to get, significant offers from other teams in the league that are in need of a goaltender. So that's kind of 2 questions, but yeah, can you trust Jordan Binnington to be an above average starter, and how are you going to replace Ville Husso if and when he leaves in free agency? The Tampa Bay Lightning, my question for them is, has their cup window closed? Personally, I don't think it has, but they're gonna most likely be a lesser team next season. Andre Palat is a UFA, Nick Paul is a UFA, and Tampa Bay has negative cap space right now. Luckily for Tampa, those are really the only 2 significant pieces that are in need of new deals, but those 2 were incredibly important for the Bolts throughout this playoff run. Andre Palat especially was a beast, so I'm definitely interested to see how they approach this offseason. I could maybe see them trying to move a guy like Alex Killorn in the final year of his contract. He was incredibly quiet throughout the postseason. Maybe they try to go that route so that they can bring, one of Paul or Palat back. The biggest question when it comes to the Maple Leafs is definitely in net, in my opinion. Jack Campbell is a UFA. He's likely priced himself out of Toronto, and after the season Peter Mrazek just had, I don't think you can really trust him to go into next season as your starting goaltender. So I'm definitely curious to see what Toronto does and how they address that starting goaltender position this offseason. The Vancouver Canucks, my biggest question for them is definitely, does JT Miller get an extension? Because if not, I feel like then at that point you have to start looking to trade him. A player like JT Miller, who's at the absolute peak of his career, just had a borderline 100-point season. You really can't risk losing a guy like that for nothing, and obviously you can still start the season with them, and then if things don't go well, look to trade him at the deadline, but then you're likely getting a lesser package for him than you would have got if you traded him this offseason. The Vegas Golden Knights, for their biggest question, I'm going to go with, can Jack Eichel get back to, playing at a superstar level? And I guess this is kind of a question for them heading into next season and not really the offseason, but as everyone knows, Jack Eichel didn't really look like the Jack Eichel we know he can be in the sample size we saw him play with Vegas, and you can't really blame him because he just went through all that drama trying to leave Buffalo. He went through surgery, he was sidelined for so long. Obviously, he's not going to jump right back in and be a superstar right away, but I'm interested to see now with the full offseason to train and recover, can he get back to being, one of the best centermen in the league? The Washington Capitals, I'm definitely going to go with goaltending for them as well. I'm interested to see how they approach that situation this offseason. Samsonov, Vanacek, and Copley are all without a contract right now. In Vanacek and Samsonov's case, they're RFAs, not UFAs, but neither of those guys performed particularly well this past season. It was rumored that Washington was in on Marc-Andre Fleury leading up to the deadline, but Fleury wouldn't accept a trade to Washington, so I'm kind of curious to see if maybe Washington tries to go out and acquire a goaltender via trade this offseason, or maybe go after a guy like Jack Campbell in free agency or something like that. And now finishing out the video with the Winnipeg Jets, my big question for them is, do they decide to finally make a big roster change? I've been pretty vocal about this. I think it's time. I think they should, and I think Mark Scheifele is a prime candidate for that, and Mark Scheifele himself kind of stirred things up a bit in the exit interviews after their season, saying, he has to do what's best for him in his career, all this, has to talk to his family first, stuff like that. So I'm kind of getting the feeling that we could see a pretty big significant move in Winnipeg over the offseason. So that is going to wrap up today's video. That was one question for every NHL team heading into the 2022 offseason. Like I said at the start, be sure to let me know your big question that you have for your favorite team heading into the summer down below in the comment section. And while you're down there, if you could, please be sure to drop a like on the video. That is the best way to show your support. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll talk to you all soon.